We have all just witnessed what a powerful role media can play in society, especially in politics. As a result of the technological developments, which first led to such inventions as the printing press, radio, television, and then the computer and the internet, media has emerged as a tool which has the power to influence and mold public opinion and actions. In this module, we'll talk about the role English language plays in the use of this powerful tool. This includes everything from radio, television, press to the social websites. In the present module, we'll talk about the use of English in the press. English is being used in the press for almost 400 years now. In the 17th century, some newspapers, some simple rudimentary newspapers were brought out in many European countries. However, there was little growth in the press and in the area of the publication of newspapers because of taxation, censorship, and also wars, which were very frequent in those times. In the 17th century, some early newspapers were published, such as the Weekly News, that is how news was spelled in those days, the London Gazette, and the Lloyd's News. These newspapers had a very restricted sphere of influence, let's say, and they provided general news and information about shipping. In the 18th century in America, we see some development in the field of the publishing of the newspapers. For example, the Boston Newsletter, the New York Gazette, the New York City, and the New York City Daily Advertiser. All these newspapers were brought out in the 18th century in the USA. In Britain, in the 18th century, we see newspapers like The Spectator and The Observer were published regularly. The 19th century was the period which saw the biggest progress in this direction, and some widely circulated newspapers were published, which included the New York Herald, the New York Tribune, the Times in Britain, and the Daily Mail. Because of so many major newspapers being published in the English language, English in the press had a very high profile. And this high profile of the English language in the press in those days was further enhanced by the invention of telegraph. As a result of this invention, several news agencies emerged. For example, Reuters and New York Associated Press, which is now known as Associated Press. So, because of first these major newspapers being published in English, and then these major news agencies being formed in English-speaking countries by English-speaking people, the profile of English in the press was further enhanced. The role of a newspaper in a community is not only that of providing information. It also, in a way, is a representative of the identity of the people the newspaper serves. For example, often in local communities, we see that the newspapers are brought out in local languages. Despite this fact, about 57% of the world's newspaper in 2002 were being published in the countries where English has some sort of special status. For example, countries like Pakistan, India, Singapore, etc., where English is an official language. So the assumption is that when 57% of the newspapers back in 2002 were being published in these countries, these must be in English, or if not all of these, many of these newspapers must be in English. Also, top five newspapers of the world are in English. Of course, this estimate may be a little subjective, but the estimates that we know of, they suggest that the top five newspapers are also in English. These include the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Times, and the Sunday Times from Britain. So all these newspapers, which are read internationally, they're all in English. Many English newspapers are intended for an international audience. For example, the Times and the New York Times, they're meant for an international global audience. When it comes to the press, it's not only the newspapers which are brought out in English. We see many other genres which are produced in English. These include fashion magazines. We have a long list of fashion magazines which are brought out from the USA and England, Cosmopolitan being one of them, which are in English. Similarly, there are many periodicals, literary reviews, scholarly journals, which are all brought out in the English language. These scholarly journals, both in hard sciences and social sciences, according to an estimate, 70 to 80% of these journals are published in English. So we see that English has a very high profile in the press and plays a very important role in spreading English throughout the world.